Good morning. My name is Lee Tolton, and this is,
Joe Tolton.
and we're here to bring the message for this Sunday. And we are the pastors at West Elkton Friends, meeting in West Elkton, Ohio. And today is um, the Sunday before Lent begins. And one of the things that Easter brings up for us is the topic of redemption. And so today we're going to talk about how those stories impact our life. Joe's going to read from Acts 9 1 through 7.
Meanwhile, Saul, still breathing threats and murder against the disciples of the Lord, went to the high priest and asked him for letters to the synagogues at Damascus, so that if he found any who belonged to the way, men or women, he might bring them bound to Jerusalem. Now he was going along and approaching Damascus. Suddenly a light from heaven flashed around him. He fell to the ground and heard a voice saying to him, "Saul, Saul, why do you persecute me?" He asked, "Who are you, Lord?" The reply came, "I am Jesus whom you are persecuting. But get up and enter the city, and you will be told what you are to do." The men who were traveling with him stood speechless because they heard the voice but saw no one. Saul got up from the ground, and though his eyes were open, he could see nothing. So they led him by the hand and brought him into Damascus.
That is a story of redemption. And we have heard this story of the beginning parts of Saul, where he is met by the light of Christ on the road. Because if any of us are met by the light of Christ, we will be redeemed. That is, no matter what we've done, no matter how we've felt. It's been a really bad week where we have seen all kinds of trauma and things happen because maybe we don't feel like other people are redeemable. But there's no such thing as a person that's not redeemable. It doesn't matter how bad they are. The light of Christ will still redeem them. And redemption stories themselves are really important. We're talking from the 1st of January, we've been talking about the power of stories. And one of the things that redemption stories do is they give brains the narrative, and they actually give children a chance to develop empathy and to believe that in anybody there is going to be something that can be redeemable. We have a couple of stories that we read when I was a child, and then now there are other ones that have come out. But I remember like the Ugly Duckling, or trying to get myself motivated to make a change with the little engine that could. You know, there's these little stories that we tell children, and the stories help to create a pathway in the brain. And one of the stories that we tell children, as traumatic as it sounds, is that Saul, as we're first introduced to Paul, has some redemptive qualities that nobody could see. We're introduced to Saul not in the 9th chapter. We're introduced to him, I think, in the 5th chapter of Acts, where Stephen is being stoned, and Saul is a young man, and he's sitting to the side, and he holds Stephen's coat that they took off of Stephen. They in the movies we put loincloths on people, but that's not what happened. They were stripped down in order to make them feel humiliated. So they were they were focused on killing this person, and a child was there. Now, narrative has a lot to do with how kids learn to think. And it's how we learn to think. If we didn't learn to think that way as a child, if maybe our parents were too caustic or too punishing and always made us feel bad about ourselves, or if we grew up with a doctrine that was too negative and didn't have a lot of positive in it, then we know that um, when we become adults, the special thing about human beings is that we can retrain ourselves to think. We can learn to think in a new way. We can be redemptive. And if we think about the incident with Saul on the road, the way that we see things has to change. And so when Saul lost his sight, it was when he was introduced to Jesus as the light. And the scales fell off of his eyes, and he did not immediately see. It takes time to make change. There's not going to be a one moment that somebody's life turns around. I know we've been told that because it's like that in stories, but that's stories. And we need to have those stories. It's fine. We just can't have unrealistic expectations of other people. We look at all the studies that have been done on redemption and how it affects our society. Dan McAdams was a psychologist at Northwestern University, and he spent years detailing these redemptive stories and narratives in a way that helped us learn how people learn from them. But in a new paper called Psychological Science, McAdams talked about the strange power of these stories and how they frame our lives, how we look at ourselves as being redemptive. And we do. When we create a personal narrative that he's talking about, we crave coherence and we crave meaning to come out of it. And so we'll glom that meaning and that ideology onto our stories. We are much more redemptive in our own stories than we are in real life. And that's because John Updike wrote about it, that we composition and crystallized memory displaces it. And that's just big words for saying we glom our meaning onto narratives about ourselves. And it's important to realize that we're not as good as we think we are. Because when we do that, hopefully we are understanding that people are not as bad as we think they are either. It was hard for me this week, and that's one of the main reasons we're supposed to love our enemies, because I watched some of the news about how the police officers were beaten and 140 were hurt. And I saw them have their humanity taken away from them. And I saw our government have the humanity taken away from them. And I feel like the news has tried to have the president's humanity taken away from him as well. And we can't do that. We have to love our enemies, because when we love our enemies, we realize that there's a redemptive quality in them. And we can't give up, because our job is to be that light of Christ that shines. We can't be the thing that holds the cloak while somebody else is getting stoned. That's not what we're called to be. We're called to be that light of Christ. Or we're called to be Ananias, the person who helps Paul cope with what has happened. We have no other real reason in this world to be other than to bring redemption from one particular situation to the next. Human beings change things. That's one of the major things that they contribute to this world, and we can change it for bad or we can change it for good. And I want us to change it for good. I want us to be a part of redemption. And we get told these things about Paul. We get told his name changed. Actually, his name changed as the people were rewriting Acts, and it may have been a mistake. So, but we think about it as redemption. We think about that. We think about, okay, well, when the people in the Old Testament changed, they gave them new names, and when the people in the New Testament changed, maybe they didn't get new names. And so we change Saul to Paul. It's another one of those things of glomming the meaning onto a narrative to help us see that redemption changes us from the deepest part of us out. That from the deepest part of us out, we change to be this person. And that's the value of redemption. God had a purpose for Saul. He saw somebody that had redeeming qualities. God saw Saul's soul. I couldn't say that as a kid because I stuttered. But God saw Saul's soul, and he knew that this person who had been from a young age involved in persecuting Christians was now able to handle this transformation. And it says that Saul's history is known to the Christians. They know him as this murderous person who leads this pack of wolves. Saul was, for what many liberals in the United States right now, is how they see the former president. And God doesn't see anybody that way. God sees what we can do, what's good in us, what's loving in us. God sees those things because those things belong to God. That is God in us when we're good, when we're truthful, when we're kind, when we're gentle, any of the things that we're told about love in 1 Corinthians 13, those things are God in us. And we need to work on redeeming and looking for redeeming qualities in other people, even when we want to castigate them off as the other. It is not okay to say that somebody is irredeemable. You have tied God's hands, and what you're doing is tying people's hands, because we, human beings, are God's hands. So when we tie our own hands, we stop looking for redemptive qualities in others, and that's not for us to do. We can't be God, and God doesn't even do that. So why can't we just look for the best in one another? It's important to see everyone as redeemable and to be willing to put our opinions aside and look for the good in others. I think about who I see when I meet someone or when I've seen the good things that they've done. I love to watch people transform into being more like Christ. That's the best part of this job. And see people become more confident and more grace filled and more loving towards one another. I just like, that's my reason for being. And I love that. So I ask you this week to look, please, at people's redeeming qualities. And if you can't see them, just pray for them, because if they're your enemy, you're supposed to be praying for them. You're supposed to be doing good for them so that those redeeming qualities show up. And when they show up, we have to help one another. I was very disappointed with how some people this week, instead of seeing the humanity in each other, just kept saying and doing the negative things about the other and making them the enemy. And that's not okay, because once we start loving an enemy, at that moment, they're no longer our enemy, they are our friend. And so the minute that we're not treating them as a friend, then that minute we have shunned God. That's when we don't love our enemies like we are told to do. So if we love our enemies, they become our friends, and we have to look for their redeeming qualities. And if we say, well, they are our enemies, I'm not going to love them, you're not saying that to me, you're saying that to God. And it's time for us to start looking for the redeeming qualities in one another and trying to find ways that we can improve each other's lives or take down the obstacles to them having a good life. It is up to us as God's hands and as God's light to be good for one another in this world. And I love the people of West Elkton, friends, because they saw the redeeming qualities in me. I hope you have a great week.